Hi there, 7th graders. This is Chapter 17, A Spirit of Reform, and this is Section 4, the Anti-Slavery Movement, starting on page 488. Do follow along. The main idea: beginning in the early 1800s, a growing number of Americans called for an end to slavery. In this section, we will learn who led the fight against slavery, what techniques anti-slavery leaders used to further their cause, and how Americans responded to abolitionists. Mr. Johnson and his servant quietly waited to board the northbound steamboat. The other passengers could not make out Johnson's face because a handkerchief was tied around his head, as if he had a toothache. Johnson and his servant appeared very anxious. They had good reason to be nervous. Johnson was actually Ellen Craft. The servant was her husband, William, and they were fugitive slaves headed to freedom. The anti-slavery movement. Ellen and William escaped from a southern plantation. Planters depended on enslaved persons to work their cotton and tobacco fields. By 1840, nearly 2.5 million enslaved people lived in the South. At one time, the North also had slavery. By 1804, every northern state legislature had passed laws to eliminate it. The southern economy, though, depended on slave labor. That is why Ellen and William headed north. They were part of an ever-growing number of enslaved African Americans who fled to free territory. Many of these men and women were aided by abolitionists, people who wanted to end slavery. Anti-slavery societies. Although a few American colonists had opposed slavery, an organized anti-slavery movement did not begin until after the Revolutionary War. A religious group called Quakers started an anti-slavery movement. Quakers had opposed slavery since colonial times. In 1775, the Quakers organized the first anti-slavery society. Other groups wished to end slavery for political reasons. The Declaration of Independence stated that all men are created equal. Yet many Americans did not apply this statement to African Americans. Reformers felt this situation had to change. By 1792, anti-slavery groups had sprung up in every state from Massachusetts to Virginia. The American Colonization Society. Meanwhile, the American Colonization Society stated it could help free African Americans. Founded in 1817, the society set up a colony for free African Americans. In 1822, President James Monroe helped the society establish a colony, Liberia, in Western Africa. At first, the society recruited African Americans to settle in Liberia. Many African Americans, though, wished to remain in the United States, their home. African Americans feared that the society aimed to strengthen slavery. By getting rid of free African Americans, slaveholders could build up the institution of slavery without opposition. Abolitionist leaders. Free African Americans joined mostly upper-class whites and became the backbone of the fight to end slavery. In 1827, two African Americans, John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish, began the first African American newspaper, an anti-slavery newspaper called Freedom's Journal. Each issue exposed the horrors of slavery and criticized slaveholders. African American David Walker also stood out among early abolitionists. He lectured against slavery and contributed articles to Freedom's Journal. In 1829, Walker published an appeal to the colored citizens of the world. Instead of speaking to would-be abolitionists, Walker's pamphlet directly addressed enslaved persons. In his appeal, Walker called on enslaved men and women to fight for their freedom. He also cautioned and encouraged them. Never make an attempt to gain your freedom until you see your way clear. When the hour arrives and you move, be not afraid or dismayed. Our sufferings will come to an end, in spite of all the Americans this side of eternity. Walker's powerful message helped give rise to a new, more militant wave of abolitionists. Abolitionists call for immediate action. In 1831, white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison founded The Liberator, a Boston anti-slavery newspaper. In the first issue, Garrison demanded the immediate emancipation or freeing of all enslaved persons. He urged abolitionists to take action without delay. The success of any great moral enterprise, he once wrote, does not depend upon numbers. Garrison denounced both Northerners who refused to be shocked by slavery and Southerners who held enslaved persons. The fight against slavery expands. In 1833, Garrison founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society. 2 years later, abolitionists formed the American Anti-Slavery Society. 63 delegates from 11 states attended the society's first meeting. This new, broader organization gave the anti-slavery cause even greater strength and fresh hope. By 1836, abolitionists had formed 500 local chapters around the country, and by 1840, membership had risen to more than 150,000. Abolitionist societies included both African American and white members. Unlike early anti-slavery societies, those formed in the 1830s demanded immediate and unconditional emancipation or freedom. Supporters of the anti-slavery movement. Abolitionists came from all sections of the country. Sisters Angelina and Sarah Grimke, born on a plantation in South Carolina, moved to Philadelphia to speak out against the horrors of slavery that they had witnessed firsthand. Journalist Elijah Lovejoy campaigned for abolition in the West. Editor Horace Greeley lobbied for emancipation in the New York Tribune. And New Englander Wendell Phillips spoke so eloquently against slavery that people called him abolition's golden trumpet. The North also had many prominent African American abolitionists, such as writer William Nell and minister Henry Highland Garnet. Garnet became famous for his impassioned challenge to enslave people. Rather die free men than to live be slaves. Isabella Baumfree, although born into slavery in New York, gained her freedom when New York abolished slavery. She changed her name to Sojourner Truth and vowed to tell the world about the cruelty of slavery. She began a tireless crusade against injustice. The most articulate African American spokesperson for the cause was Frederick Douglass. Born into slavery, Douglass secretly taught himself to read, although Southern laws prohibited it. Douglass escaped from slavery in Maryland in 1838 and settled in Massachusetts. By 1842, speaking as a recent graduate from the institution of slavery with his diploma on his back, he captivated audiences by talking about his life in bondage. Douglass also spoke out against the injustices faced by free African Americans. In addition to his public speaking, Douglass edited a widely read abolitionist journal called the North Star. Douglass's speaking and writing abilities so impressed audiences that opponents refused to believe that he had even been a slave. They alleged that he was an imposter put in place by the abolitionists. In reply, he wrote 3 very moving autobiographies. The Underground Railroad. Many abolitionists, like Douglass, did more than lecture and write. They became conductors on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad began around 1817. It was not an actual railroad, but a series of houses where conductors hid runaway enslaved persons and helped them to reach the next station or safe house on the railroad. Enslaved African Americans made their way to the North or Canada on the railroad. Harriet Tubman became the most famous African American conductor on the Underground Railroad. Tubman fled from slavery in 1849. Afterwards, she helped others escape. She returned to the South 19 times and led more than 300 enslaved people, including her own parents, to freedom. Slaveholders offered a reward of $40,000 for her. That's an incredible amount of money at that time point. For her, dead or alive. But she always avoided capture. Response to the anti-slavery movement. Abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison soon became unpopular in the North and the South. Garrison's fiery declarations against slavery raised tensions between Northerners and Southerners. He chose as his motto, "No union with slaveholders," and supported the peaceful separation of the free states from the slave states. Northern workers react against abolitionists. Many Northerners disapproved of the anti-slavery movement. These Northerners included mostly mill owners and bankers who depended on cotton from the South. They viewed the abolitionists' attacks on slavery as threats to their businesses and wealth. Other Northerners feared that free African Americans would come to the North and take their jobs. Northerners snubbed abolitionists and excluded them from social gatherings. They pelted anti-slavery speakers with eggs and stones. Some abolitionists even lost their jobs because of their beliefs. One abolitionist, Elijah Lovejoy, lost his life because of his beliefs. He made some Northerners angry by writing anti-slavery editorials in his Illinois journal, the Alton Observer. 3 times, a mob destroyed his printing presses. Lovejoy continued to attack slavery. On November 7, 1837, attackers set fire to his presses and then shot Lovejoy. His death shocked many Northerners and caused them to join the anti-slavery movement. Southerners defend slavery. The movement to end slavery made many Southerners uneasy. They accused abolitionists of encouraging violence. Southern clergy argued that the Bible condoned slavery. Others contended slaveholders treated the enslaved well. Southerners who favored abolition usually remained quiet or moved north. The anti-slavery movement deepened the division between the North and the South. The South threatened to leave the Union unless government authorities agreed to suppress abolitionist materials. Southern postal workers refused to deliver abolitionist newspapers. The anti-slavery movement threatened the Southern way of life, and Southern hostility to abolition continued to grow. In 1836, under Southern pressure, the House of Representatives passed a gag rule providing that all abolitionist proposals be set aside without debate. Despite the tensions, the anti-slavery movement affected national politics very little at first. The Missouri Compromise had fixed boundaries between slave and free states. At this time, no prominent politician wished to endanger the Union by attacking slavery in the South. Thanks for listening.